The smoke hung thick in the Golden Nuggets high-stakes poker room on the night of March 14, 1973, mixing with the scent of expensive cologne and cheaper whiskey. Frank Morrison shuffled the deck with the practiced ease of a man who had dealt 40,000 hands, his fingers moving in that hypnotic rhythm that made tourists think dealing cards was simple. The overhead lights caught the gold in his wedding band as he sent cards spinning across green felt to 5 players who represented at least 3 continents and probably twice as many agendas. What Morrison believed that night was that his job was straightforward: deal cards, watch for cheaters, collect his paycheck, and go home to his wife and 2 daughters in Henderson. He was completely wrong. Before the sun rose over the desert, Frank Morrison would become the unlikely pivot point in an intelligence operation that reached from the Las Vegas Strip to the depths of the Kremlin, proving that sometimes the most important Cold War battles were fought not with missiles or spies in dark alleys, but across a poker table by a dealer who simply knew when something did not feel right. But before we dive into this story, make sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel so we can bring you the most gripping Cold War and espionage stories every day. And tell me in the comments where you are watching from. It really helps support us. Frank Morrison had not planned to become a card dealer. 28 years earlier, he had been a navigator on a B-17 bomber, flying missions over Germany with a bombardier who shook so badly before each run that Frank had to help him light his cigarettes. The war had taught Frank to read people under pressure, to notice the small things that separated someone holding it together from someone about to fall apart. After the war, those skills had seemed useless in civilian life until a buddy from his old Army Air Forces unit got him an interview at the Golden Nugget in 1956. The pit boss had asked him one question: "Can you spot a cheat?" Frank had replied with another question: "Can you spot when someone is lying about being able to spot a cheat?" He got the job. By 1973, Frank Morrison was what they called an old hand in a young man's industry. At 51, he had seen Las Vegas transform from a dusty gambling outpost into a glittering city that drew everyone from Hollywood celebrities to mobsters to mysterious foreigners with diplomatic passports and nervous smiles. The city had grown fat on money from sources both legitimate and otherwise, and Frank had learned not to ask too many questions about who was sitting at his table. But he had also learned to watch, always watch, because in a casino, the small details were everything. The Nevada test site, just 65 miles northwest of the Strip, had been exploding nuclear bombs since 1951. Frank remembered when you could see the mushroom clouds from downtown, back when they called Las Vegas the Atomic City and sold commemorative postcards. The tests had brought scientists, military officers, and government contractors, all of them with security clearances and expense accounts and a taste for cards. They had also brought something else that Frank only learned about later: intelligence operatives from both sides of the Iron Curtain, circling each other in the neon glow like sharks in illuminated water. The man who would change everything for Frank Morrison walked into the poker room at exactly 9:47 that March evening. Frank noticed him immediately, not because he looked suspicious, but because he looked too perfect. The man was somewhere in his mid-40s, with dark hair going silver at the temples, an expensive suit that managed to look European without being flashy, and the kind of smooth, friendly face that made people want to trust him. He introduced himself as Victor Kozlov, said he was a trade representative from a Canadian import-export firm, and bought into the game with $5,000 in crisp $100 bills. Frank dealt the cards and watched. It was what he always did. In 17 years of dealing poker, he had developed instincts that operated below conscious thought, pattern recognition systems that flagged anomalies before his rational mind could articulate what was wrong. And something about Victor Kozlov was wrong, though Frank could not yet say what. The other players at the table were regulars. Gerald Hoffman owned 3 car dealerships in Southern California and played poker the way he sold cars, aggressively and with a permanent smile that never reached his eyes. Martin Chen was an engineer from Los Angeles who worked for an aerospace contractor and played with mathematical precision, tracking odds with the intensity of a man solving differential equations. Robert Bobby Castellano claimed to be in commercial real estate, though Frank suspected his actual business involved less paperwork and more broken kneecaps. The 5th player was Sarah Wainwright, a rare female presence in the high-stakes room who had made her money in Nevada real estate during the boom years, and played poker with a fearless aggression that intimidated men twice her size. Viktor Kozlov played well. Not too well, which would have drawn attention, but competently enough to hold his own. He made intelligent bets, folded when he should, and engaged in the kind of friendly table talk that marked him as a social player rather than a professional. He told a story about nearly freezing to death during a business trip to Winnipeg that had everyone laughing. He complimented Sarah on her emerald bracelet. He asked Bobby about the real estate market in Las Vegas, with exactly the right blend of casual interest and deference. Everything about him was perfectly calibrated to make him forgettable. But Frank Morrison had not survived 17 years dealing cards in Las Vegas by accepting people at face value. As he dealt hand after hand, he began cataloguing the small discrepancies in Viktor Kozlov's performance. The man's accent, for instance. He claimed to be from Toronto, but occasionally his vowels shifted in ways that suggested someone who had learned English from a British teacher rather than growing up with Canadian inflections. His hands, too, told a story. They were soft, yes, the hands of a businessman, but Frank noticed calluses on the inside of his right index finger and thumb that looked like they came from extensive handgun training, not shuffling papers in an import-export office. The biggest tell, though, came during a hand about 90 minutes into the session. Martin Chen had raised aggressively on a hand that showed 3 hearts on the board. Gerald Hoffman folded with a theatrical sigh. Sarah Wainwright pushed all her chips to the center with a smile that could have meant anything. Bobby Castellano stared at his cards like they contained the secrets of the universe before folding with a grunt. That left Viktor Kozlov. Frank watched as Kozlov considered his options. The man's face remained calm, pleasant, unrevealing, but his left hand resting on the table made a small gesture, so quick and subtle that Frank almost missed it. 3 fingers tapped the felt in a specific pattern: index, middle, ring. Then the hand went still. Kozlov called the bet. Sarah turned over her cards to reveal a flush. Kozlov showed a full house and collected the pot with a modest smile and an apology to Sarah that sounded entirely sincere. Frank Morrison had seen that gesture before, not at a poker table, but in a classified briefing he had received 6 months earlier. The briefing had been voluntary, one of those things the casino offered to experienced dealers who might encounter foreign intelligence operatives trying to gather information from loose-lipped government contractors. The FBI agent who conducted the session had shown them examples of Soviet hand signals used by KGB operatives to communicate with assets. Frank had thought it was fascinating in an academic way, but never expected to see it in real life. 3 fingers, index, middle, ring. In the Soviet system the FBI agent had described, that meant proceed with confidence. It was a signal an operative might give to an asset to confirm that a situation was secure, that they should continue with a planned action. But who was Kozlov signaling? Frank glanced around the poker room, trying not to be obvious. About 30 feet away, a man in his 30s sat at the blackjack table, playing with the distracted air of someone killing time. He wore glasses, a bland sport coat, and had the forgettable face of a mid-level bureaucrat. Frank had noticed him earlier because the man was a terrible blackjack player, making decisions that violated basic strategy so egregiously that Frank had wondered if he was drunk. But now, watching more carefully, Frank saw the blackjack player glance toward the poker table at the exact moment Kozlov made his hand signal. The glance lasted perhaps half a second, but it was there. And then the blackjack player made his own subtle gesture, adjusting his glasses in a way that looked natural, but involved touching the frame 3 times with his right index finger. Frank Morrison felt his pulse quicken in a way it had not since he flew bombing runs over Hamburg. He forced himself to breathe normally, to keep dealing cards with the same rhythm he had maintained for the past 2 hours. If Viktor Kozlov and the blackjack player were Soviet operatives, and if they were signaling each other in the middle of the Golden Nugget, then they were doing it for a reason. Frank thought about the other players at his table. Martin Chen worked for an aerospace firm with defense contracts. Gerald Hoffman sold cars, but those dealerships could be fronts for other activities. Even Bobby Castellano, despite his probable mob connections, might have information valuable to Soviet intelligence. The question was what to do about it. Frank was a card dealer, not a spy catcher. He could go to his pit boss, but what would he say? That he thought a player might be a Soviet agent because of the way he tapped his fingers. They would think he had been drinking. He could call the FBI, but by the time anyone arrived, Kozlov and his partner would be gone. And if Frank was wrong, if this was all just paranoid pattern matching by a dealer who had sat through one too many security briefings, he would look like a fool. Frank dealt another hand. Kozlov received a pair of tens. He bet conservatively, projecting the image of a cautious player protecting a medium-strong hand. But Frank noticed that as Kozlov organized his chips, he arranged them in stacks of specific heights. 3 stacks of 5 chips each, then 2 stacks of 7. It could have been random. But Frank remembered another detail from the FBI briefing. Soviet operatives sometimes used chip arrangements to convey numerical information. 3527. Frank had no idea what those numbers might mean, but he knew they meant something. The night wore on. Kozlov won some hands, lost others, maintaining the profile of a competent amateur having a good evening. He ordered drinks, tipped the cocktail waitress generously, and told another story about a moose that had wandered into his hotel parking lot in Banff. He was, in every visible way, exactly what he claimed to be. A businessman from Canada enjoying some recreational gambling in Las Vegas. But Frank Morrison had spent 30 years learning to see beyond the visible. Every small detail about Viktor Kozlov accumulated in his mind, like evidence at a crime scene. The way Kozlov held his cards suggested military training in maintaining awareness of his surroundings. The watch on his wrist was Swiss, expensive but not ostentatious, except that Frank recognized it as a model favored by Eastern European intelligence services because it contained a hidden compartment in the band. The way Kozlov's eyes scanned the room during conversation was too systematic, too practiced, like someone who had been trained to maintain constant situational awareness. Around midnight, Sarah Wainwright excused herself from the game, explaining that she had an early meeting with contractors. Gerald Hoffman left 20 minutes later, grumbling about his losses. That left Martin Chen, Bobby Castellano, and Viktor Kozlov. Frank noticed that Kozlov's attention seemed to sharpen after the others departed. His conversation with Chen became more focused, more probing. Where exactly did Chen work? What kind of projects was his company handling? The questions were casual, wrapped in the friendly banter of poker players killing time, but Frank heard the intelligence gathering underneath. Martin Chen, perhaps loosened by several scotches, began talking about his work. He mentioned a new guidance system his company was developing, complained about the bureaucratic obstacles to getting security clearances processed, made a joke about how the Soviets would probably steal the technology anyway through some spy with a camera. Kozlov laughed along with everyone else, but Frank saw him file away every detail Chen revealed. It was at 1:37 in the morning when Frank Morrison made his decision. He could not prove that Viktor Kozlov was a Soviet intelligence officer. He had no smoking gun, no definitive evidence that would convince a skeptical audience. What he had were 17 years of reading people across a card table, instincts honed by 10,000 hours of watching, for the tiny signals that separated honest players from cheaters, and a certainty in his gut that something was very wrong. Frank excused himself from the table, telling the players he needed a bathroom break and that a relief dealer would take over. This was unusual, but not unprecedented. He walked through the casino floor with measured steps, resisting the urge to hurry. In his pocket was a business card the FBI agent had given him at the end of that security briefing 6 months ago. The agent had said to call if Frank ever saw anything suspicious. At the time, Frank had thought it was just FBI paranoia, the kind of thing that made sense in a government office, but had no connection to the real world of card dealers and tourists and people just trying to have a good time. The payphone was near the restrooms, far enough from the poker room that Kozlov would not see him. Frank dropped in a dime and dialed the number on the card. It rang 4 times before a man's voice answered with a simple, "Hello." Frank identified himself, gave the code phrase he had been told to use, and explained what he had observed. The voice on the other end asked precise questions. What specific hand signals had he seen? What was the subject doing now? Who were the other players? Frank answered each question, feeling simultaneously foolish and certain that he was doing the right thing. The voice told Frank to return to his table and continue dealing as if nothing had happened. Federal agents would arrive within the hour, but they would not be obvious. Frank was to watch for a signal. A man in a brown jacket would sit at the bar nearest the poker room and order a gin and tonic with 3 olives. That would mean the surveillance team was in place. Frank was to continue his normal routine and let the professionals handle the rest. Frank returned to the poker table, where the relief dealer was managing a hand between Chen, Castellano, and Kozlov. Frank thanked him and resumed his position. His heart was beating faster than normal, but his hands remained steady as he picked up the cards. This was the thing about being a good card dealer. You learned to perform under pressure, to maintain the external calm regardless of what was happening inside. The game continued. Kozlov was chatting with Martin Chen about the upcoming baseball season, whether the Oakland Athletics could defend their championship. Bobby Castellano was dividing his attention between his cards and a blonde cocktail waitress who kept smiling at him. Everything seemed normal, just another late-night poker game in a Las Vegas casino, except that Frank Morrison now knew that nothing about this game was normal. He watched Kozlov with new eyes, seeing past the affable businessman persona to the trained intelligence operative underneath. He noticed how Kozlov positioned himself at the table to maintain sight lines to both entrances to the poker room. He saw how the man's casual conversation with Chen kept circling back to technical details about Chen's work, extracting information through a combination of friendly interest and alcohol-enabled indiscretion. This was not a card game. This was an intelligence operation, and Frank Morrison was dealing cards in the middle of it. At 2:15, a man in a brown jacket sat down at the bar and ordered a drink. Frank could not hear what he ordered from his position at the poker table, but when the bartender placed the glass on the counter, Frank saw 3 olives floating in clear liquid. The surveillance team was in position. Frank dealt another hand. His role now was to be invisible, to maintain the normal rhythm of the game, while federal agents did whatever federal agents did in situations like this. He wondered if they would arrest Kozlov right there in the casino or follow him to see where he went, who he met. He wondered if the blackjack player was still at his table, or if he had sensed something wrong and disappeared into the night. Viktor Kozlov bet 500 on a pair of jacks. Martin Chen raised to 1,000. Bobby Castellano folded with a disgusted shake of his head. Kozlov called. The turn card was a 7 of diamonds. Chen bet 1,500. Kozlov studied him for a long moment, then folded with a gracious nod. Chen collected the pot without showing his cards. At 2:41, 3 things happened almost simultaneously. First, the man in the brown jacket at the bar stood up and walked toward the restrooms, speaking briefly into what looked like a cigarette lighter, but was probably a radio. Second, 2 more men entered the poker room from different directions, both wearing the bland sport coats and forgettable faces of federal agents everywhere. Third, Viktor Kozlov glanced at his watch, made a small gesture with his left hand that looked like straightening his cuff, and began gathering his chips with the casual air of someone ready to call it a night. Frank Morrison dealt 1 more hand, knowing it would be the last of the evening. He sent cards spinning across the felt to Chen, Castellano, and Kozlov, his movements automatic after 17 years of repetition. Chen looked at his cards and immediately folded. Castellano bet the minimum. Kozlov called. The flop came. Queen of hearts, 3 of clubs, 9 of spades. Castellano checked. Kozlov bet 200. Castellano called. The turn was a king of diamonds. Castellano checked again. Kozlov bet 500. This time, Castellano folded. As Kozlov reached for the pot, one of the federal agents materialized at the table, with the sudden presence of a man who had been trained to appear from nowhere. He was holding a leather credential case, open to display a badge and identification card. His voice was quiet but carried the absolute authority of the federal government. Mr. Kozlov, I am Special Agent William Henderson of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I would like to speak with you regarding a matter of national security. Would you mind accompanying me to a private area? The transformation in Kozlov was instantaneous and complete. The friendly businessman vanished, replaced by something harder and more calculating. His expression did not change, but his eyes went flat and watchful in a way that confirmed everything Frank had suspected. This was a man who had prepared for this moment, who had trained for it in some facility outside Moscow, who knew exactly what to do when an operation went wrong. Of course, Agent Henderson, Kozlov said, his accent suddenly more pronounced, the Canadian inflections dropping away to reveal something Eastern European underneath. I am always happy to cooperate with law enforcement. Martin Chen looked confused. Bobby Castellano looked angry, probably calculating how this interruption would affect his gaming experience. Frank Morrison just kept his hands on the cards and watched. 2 more agents had appeared at the blackjack table where Kozlov's partner had been sitting, but the chair was empty. The forgettable man with the glasses had vanished at some point in the past hour, probably the moment he sensed surveillance. Frank wondered if they would catch him, or if he was already in a car heading for California or Arizona, already initiating whatever backup plans Soviet intelligence had prepared for exactly this contingency. Agent Henderson and his partner escorted Kozlov out of the poker room with the kind of practiced efficiency that suggested they had done this before. The remaining players looked at Frank for explanation. He shrugged and began collecting cards with studied nonchalance, as if federal agents interrupted poker games every night. "Gentlemen, I think we can call it an evening," Frank said. "Please take your chips to the cashier." Bobby Castellano muttered something uncomplimentary about the FBI and grabbed his chips. Martin Chen looked pale, probably realizing that he had been talking too freely about classified work. Frank watched them go, then began the automatic process of securing the table for the night. A different federal agent appeared at Frank's elbow as he was organizing chips into racks. This one was older, with gray hair and the weathered face of someone who had spent decades in law enforcement. He introduced himself as Special Agent Robert Calloway and asked if Frank would mind answering some questions. Frank agreed, and they walked to a small office the casino management made available. For the next 2 hours, Frank Morrison described everything he had observed, the hand signals, the chip arrangements, the subtle tells in Kozlov's behavior that had triggered his suspicion. Agent Calloway took notes in a small leather notebook, asking precise questions that suggested he knew far more about Viktor Kozlov than he was sharing. When Frank described the signal he had seen Kozlov give to the blackjack player, Calloway's expression hardened in a way that confirmed the second man's importance. "You did good work tonight, Mr. Morrison," Calloway said when they were finished. "The man you identified is named Viktor Alexandrovich Kozlov, though that is probably not his real name. He is a colonel in the KGB's first chief directorate, which handles foreign intelligence operations. We have been tracking him for 8 months, ever since he arrived in North America using Canadian documentation. What we did not know until tonight was that he had a partner operating with him here in Las Vegas." Frank absorbed this information in silence. A KGB colonel, sitting at his poker table, chatting about baseball and Canadian winters while gathering intelligence from a drunk aerospace engineer. It seemed surreal, like something from a spy novel rather than a Wednesday night at the Golden Nugget. "What will happen to him?" Frank asked. Agent Calloway closed his notebook and stood. "That is classified, Mr. Morrison, but I can tell you that Colonel Kozlov will not be gathering intelligence in American casinos anymore. Thanks to you, we have neutralized an active KGB operation targeting defense contractors in Nevada and California." Frank thought about his 2 daughters, sleeping safely in Henderson, while their father dealt cards in a casino. He thought about the Cold War that had been running in the background of American life since he flew bombing missions in 1944, that vast ideological struggle between democracy and communism that touched everything from nuclear arsenals to poker tables in Las Vegas. He thought about the small role he had just played in that enormous conflict, a role no one would ever know about, except the handful of people in this room. "Am I going to have to testify?" Frank asked. "Probably not," Calloway replied. "This will be handled diplomatically. Colonel Kozlov has diplomatic immunity through his Canadian cover, so we cannot prosecute him. But we can expel him and make it clear to the Soviets that we are aware of their intelligence operations in Nevada. Sometimes in this business, Mr. Morrison, the victory is not in putting someone in jail, but in forcing them to shut down an operation and start over." They shook hands. And Agent Calloway left Frank with another business card and instructions to call if he ever saw anything suspicious again. Frank walked out of the office into a casino that was beginning to fill with the early morning crowd. Retirees playing nickel slots, construction workers stopping in for breakfast, and a few hands of blackjack on their way to job sites. Tourists who had stayed up all night and could not quite remember why that had seemed like a good idea. Frank Morrison went to the cashier, collected his tips from the night, and walked out into a Las Vegas dawn that painted the desert sky in shades of orange and pink. The temperature had dropped into the 50s, and he could smell the desert creosote bushes that grew in the vacant lots between casinos. He got into his 1969 Chevy and drove home through streets that were just beginning to wake up. His wife, Ellen, was making coffee when he walked in the door. She looked at him with the knowing expression of a woman who had been married to a card dealer for 15 years and asked if it had been a quiet night. Frank poured himself a cup of coffee and sat at the kitchen table, looking out the window at the suburban street where his daughters would soon be riding their bicycles to school. Quiet enough, he said. He never told Ellen about Viktor Kozlov. The FBI had made it clear that the whole affair was classified, and besides, what would he say? That he had helped catch a Soviet spy by noticing the wrong kind of calluses on the man's hands, that he had spent 6 hours dealing cards to a KGB colonel who was gathering intelligence about American defense projects. It sounded absurd even to Frank, and he had lived through it. But in the weeks and months that followed, Frank Morrison found himself watching his tables differently. He paid more attention during the security briefings the casino offered. He studied the players more carefully, looking for the small discrepancies that might indicate someone was not who they claimed to be. He never saw anything as dramatic as Viktor Kozlov again, but he flagged 2 potential card cheats and one man who turned out to be wanted for embezzlement in Texas. The Golden Nugget management never knew exactly what had happened that March night in 1973. They knew federal agents had interviewed one of their players and that the player had left Las Vegas and never returned, but the FBI had been tight-lipped about the details. Frank's pit boss asked him a few questions, got vague answers, and let the matter drop. In the world of Las Vegas casinos, federal agents appearing in the middle of the night was unusual, but not unprecedented. The city lived in the intersection of gambling, organized crime, and Cold War politics. Strange things happened. 3 months after the Kozlov incident, Frank received a letter at his home. It had no return address, and the postmark was from Washington, D.C. Inside was a single-typed page on government letterhead. The letter thanked Frank Morrison for his service to his country and informed him that the information he had provided had led to the disruption of a significant foreign intelligence operation. It was signed by someone whose title included the word director, but whose actual identity Frank could not determine. He read the letter twice, then burned it in his fireplace as the final paragraph had instructed him to do. Frank Morrison continued dealing cards at the Golden Nugget for another 12 years. He taught both his daughters to play poker, explaining the mathematics of odds and the psychology of reading opponents. He watched Las Vegas continue its transformation from a desert gambling town into a corporate entertainment destination. He saw the old mob-connected casinos get bought out by respectable corporations. He dealt cards to celebrities, criminals, tourists, and the occasional spy, though none as memorable as Viktor Kozlov. In 1985, Frank retired from the Golden Nugget with a pension and a gold watch. At his retirement party, the casino manager gave a speech about Frank's 17 years of loyal service, his professionalism, his skill at managing difficult players. No one mentioned the night in 1973 when Frank Morrison had identified a Soviet intelligence colonel and helped shut down a KGB operation targeting American defense contractors. That story remained classified, known only to the handful of FBI agents who had worked the case and the intelligence analysts who had processed the aftermath. Frank Morrison lived another 22 years after his retirement, long enough to see the Berlin Wall fall and the Soviet Union collapse, long enough to watch the Cold War end and a new century begin. He never spoke publicly about Viktor Kozlov, honoring the classified nature of the incident even as details of other Cold War operations were declassified and published. But sometimes, late at night, he would sit on his porch in Henderson and think about that March evening when the Cold War had come to his poker table. He thought about the strange intersection of espionage and entertainment that defined Las Vegas during those years, when nuclear bombs exploded in the desert just miles from slot machines and roulette wheels, when Soviet intelligence officers posed as Canadian businessmen and gathered secrets across card tables. He thought about the massive intelligence apparatus of the Cold War, the thousands of agents and analysts and surveillance teams, and the improbable fact that one poker dealer in Nevada had played a small but crucial role in that vast machinery. Most of all, Frank thought about the importance of paying attention, of trusting instincts honed by experience, of recognizing when something was not quite right, even if you could not immediately articulate why. He had learned those lessons as a navigator over Germany, watching for fighter planes in the clouds. He had refined them dealing cards in Las Vegas, watching for cheaters and card counters. And on one night in March 1973, those lessons had mattered in ways that reached far beyond a casino floor. The official records of the Kozlov case remain classified to this day. Historians and intelligence researchers occasionally reference it in footnotes as an example of KGB operations during the Cold War's height, but the details are vague and the names are redacted. The casino industry has no record of the incident. The players who were at Frank Morrison's table that night probably never knew they had been sitting with a Soviet intelligence officer, and if they suspected something, they kept it to themselves. But in the classified archives of the FBI's Counterintelligence Division, there is a file that tells the story of how one card dealer in Las Vegas noticed the wrong calices, the wrong hand signals, the wrong arrangement of chips. The file contains Frank Morrison's statements, Agent Calloway's reports, photographs of Viktor Kozlov taken by surveillance teams, and an analysis of the intelligence operation that Kozlov had been running from his base in Toronto. The file documents how Kozlov had been targeting defense contractors, aerospace engineers, and military personnel who traveled to Las Vegas for business or pleasure. How he had been collecting fragments of information about missile guidance systems, aircraft designs, and nuclear weapons research. How those fragments, assembled and analyzed by Soviet intelligence, would have given the USSR valuable insights into American military capabilities. The file also documents how Frank Morrison's tip had allowed the FBI to identify Kozlov's network in North America, leading to the expulsion of 3 Soviet intelligence officers operating under diplomatic cover and the disruption of KGB operations across the western United States. It was not the kind of dramatic victory that made headlines or changed the course of the Cold War, but it was the kind of incremental success that defined much of the intelligence work during that long twilight struggle. Frank Morrison died in 2007 at the age of 85. His obituary in the Las Vegas Review-Journal described him as a retired casino dealer, a World War II veteran, a devoted husband and father, and an active member of his church community. It mentioned his love of gardening and his skill at poker. It said nothing about the night he helped catch a Soviet spy, because that story was still classified and would remain so for decades to come. But the people who knew Frank best, his wife and daughters and the dealers who had worked alongside him at the Golden Nugget, they knew there was something more to his story. They had seen the letter that arrived from Washington that he would not discuss. They had noticed the federal agents, who occasionally contacted him over the years, with questions about players he had observed. They understood that Frank Morrison had lived a larger life than his modest demeanor suggested, that he had been part of something significant even if he could not talk about it. The Cold War was fought on many fronts. There were the obvious ones: Berlin, Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan. There were the nuclear standoffs and the proxy wars, and the diplomatic confrontations that dominated headlines. But there were also the quiet fronts, the intelligence operations conducted in hotel rooms and airport lounges and casino poker rooms, where trained operatives gathered fragments of information that might give their side an advantage in the larger struggle. On one of those quiet fronts on a March night in Las Vegas in 1973, a card dealer named Frank Morrison had noticed that a player's hands were wrong, his accent was inconsistent, his chip arrangements were too precise. Frank had trusted his instincts, made a phone call, and set in motion a chain of events that disrupted a Soviet intelligence operation. It was not a dramatic victory. There were no gunfights or car chases or last-minute rescues, but in the patient, grinding work of Cold War intelligence, it was the kind of victory that mattered. The Golden Nugget still stands on Fremont Street in downtown Las Vegas, though it has been renovated and reimagined many times since Frank Morrison dealt cards there. The poker room where Victor Kozlov sat and smiled and gathered secrets has been relocated and redesigned. The specific table where Frank noticed the wrong calluses is long gone, probably broken up for scrap decades ago. But the story remains, preserved in classified files and in the memories of the few people who knew what really happened that night. Las Vegas has changed almost beyond recognition since 1973. The mob influence has been replaced by corporate ownership. The nuclear testing at the nearby test site ended in 1992. The Cold War itself ended with the collapse of the Soviet Union, taking with it the ideological struggle that had defined international relations for nearly half a century. But the city still draws people from around the world, still serves as a crossroads where secrets are shared and intelligence is gathered, and fortunes change on the turn of a card. And somewhere in the classified archives of American intelligence, Frank Morrison's story serves as a reminder that sometimes the most important observations come not from satellite photographs or intercepted communications, but from a dealer in a smoky poker room who noticed that something was not quite right and had the courage to act on that observation. In the vast machinery of Cold War espionage, with its budgets of billions and its armies of analysts and its networks spanning continents, it was a poker dealer in Nevada who saw what others missed and made the call that mattered. That is the nature of intelligence work, and perhaps the nature of history itself. The great events are shaped not only by presidents and generals and spy masters, but also by ordinary people in ordinary places who notice the small details that do not fit, who trust their instincts even when they cannot fully explain them, who understand that paying attention matters. Frank Morrison was one of those people. His story deserves to be told, even if the full details remain locked away in classified files that may not be opened for another 50 years. The poker table where it all happened is gone. The casino has changed. The Cold War has ended. But the lesson remains relevant in any era, that vigilance matters, that small observations can have large consequences, and that sometimes the most important battles are fought not with weapons but with attention, patience, and the willingness to act when something seems wrong. Frank Morrison understood that. It is why he called the FBI on a March night in 1973. It is why a Soviet intelligence operation was disrupted and American secrets remained protected. And it is why his story, even told decades later with the details that can be shared, remains a testament to the importance of the small victories, the quiet heroism, and the ordinary people who shaped extraordinary events. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. Do not forget to subscribe for more incredible stories and check out the video on screen. I am sure you will enjoy it. See you next time.